If you suspect jamming attacks against your Wi-Fi network, deauthentication and disassociation packets are the most likely suspects. In a previous video, we showed how to build a Wi-Fi link monitor to determine whether or not your network was being interfered with. But today, we'll use a NodeMCU to detect the actual packets behind these sorts of attacks on this episode of Cyber Weapons Lab. Most script-kiddie jamming attacks rely on two different types of packets in order to get their work done. These are disassociation and deauthentication, and they're both types of packets that regulate the way that Wi-Fi networks connect to different devices. Now, this is a vulnerability because they're not encrypted, which means anybody can fake them and disconnect clients from stations all over a nearby area. Now, the way that we can detect this and go a step beyond our previous detector is by actually looking for the packets behind these attacks. And we got a little bit of feedback from our last Wi-Fi link monitor that it was a little bit like detecting a power outage with a lamp. So we're going to go ahead and do a little bit more and actually detect those two types of packets that cause these sorts of attacks to be effective. Now, to make this work, we're going to use a project by Spacehoon, which is called the Deauth detector, and originally was programmed to just turn on an LED when you detect a certain amount of both of these combined sorts of packets. But instead, we're going to break this out and differentiate between the two different types so we can tell what sort of tool the attacker is using rather than just that they're attacking us. So we can generally assume that someone is using something like AirPlayNG or another sort of jamming attack that only uses deauthentication if we just see a one-color attack when we're detecting a jamming attack against our network. But if we are seeing two different colors, that means we're seeing something like MDK3, which uses a combination of both deauthentication and disassociation in order to function. Now, what we're basically doing is getting a peek into what the attacker is really doing or what tool they're using when they're running this jamming attack, rather than just checking to see if the link is being interfered with. So this truly is a Deauth detector, and it's going a step further because we're actually classifying the attack as well. Now, to get started, we'll need to have the NodeMCU plugged into a computer with Arduino IDE, and we'll also need to make sure that we have a 3-color LED or some sort of LED that we can differentiate at least 2 colors on. So if you just happen to have 2 colors lying around, then that's fine too. Last, you'll need to have a power source and a Wi-Fi connection that you can, I guess if you want to test it, attempt to attack without getting in trouble. So if you have access to one of these, or if you want to use your cell phone's hotspot, these will all work perfectly fine. Once you have all these together, then we can begin. Now, the first thing you'll need to have installed in order to follow this guide is Arduino IDE. I'm going to go ahead and open this up, and in order to work with the NodeMCU, you'll have to change a couple things around in order to make it work. If you just use the default board and don't switch it, it will absolutely not work at all. So once you have your NodeMCU plugged in, I'll show you where you need to go in and start changing things. Now, this is an old file, so I'll go ahead and open a new one. And we can go into File, Preferences, and you'll need to copy and paste this JSON address right here in order to include the ESP8266 packages. Once this is included, we can go into the Tool setting and then go to the Board Manager or Boards Manager and type in the search, once it finishes downloading the platform's index, ESP8266. And here you can see the ESP8266 by community. Go ahead and install this, and this should be everything you need to get started with this particular tool. Now, once you have this together, we can take a look at our project and get started with the actual code. So this was originally created by Spacehoon, and I've modified the code a little bit to give us more visibility into what is actually happening. You can see his original prototype here is really awesome and tiny and uses a very small version of the 8266. So you can see that our NodeMCU can really be turned into something quite small if we want to go that way. So there are a couple dependencies here in the form of libraries. And what this means is you'll need to include these, otherwise the sketch won't work. Here you can see mac.cpp and mac.h are both going to need to be included, so we'll need to install those as well in order for our project to function correctly. we can click on clone or download, copy, and then in a terminal window, put a new one, we can type git clone, and then, oops, let me grab it. Git clone, and then the address here. There we go. So this will go ahead and download all the libraries and everything, and we can type cd, cd deauth detector, and then ls, and see that we have our deauth detector files here. So I'm actually going to open this up, and we'll need to include these. So let's go into our downloads, or actually it would be in our root folder. Here it is. We'll get these two libraries here. And now we can go into our Arduino sketch. And let's close out these old ones. Once we close out these old sketches, we can go ahead and click on Sketch and then Add File. Now this is where we'll navigate to where we downloaded this. And we can first select the mac.cpp, and then again go to Sketch and Add File. And select mac.h. Awesome. So now we can actually go and take the code directly if we want. Let's go to the GitHub page. We can click on deauth detector, and we'll click on deauthdetector.ino. And now, in order to copy and paste it, we'll click on raw, which will give us the ability to just copy this wholesale and paste it into our IDE sketch. There we go. Now we have this laid out, and I'm going to go through the code and explain what's happening so we can see the changes we've made and explain a little bit about the way that this code works. Now here we've gone through, and originally what happened is we were setting a packet rate, and this would just check, and if a counter titled C, this unsigned long variable right here, got up to 3 within a minute, then it would turn on the LED. So this is pretty simple, and I wanted to see if we could get more information out of this and make it useful for a blue team or maybe somebody else who suspects some sort of jamming and wants to diagnose exactly what's going on. So here we can see some other variables that will control the way the script behaves, including channel hopping, which will either tell it to stay on a single channel or go all over the place and go through all the available channels, the channel to start on, and then the max channel. So if you're in Japan, that would be 14. If you're in the United States, that's 11, which will tell the script how far to go before going back to the start if you are doing channel hopping. Now the LED pin will be the pin that is set to actually manipulate the LED, and then we also have the option to be inverted if we have an LED that uses low instead of high to turn on, which is something that comes up occasionally, but I didn't really find it very useful in this particular setup. So last we'll have defined default packet rate, but we're not going to be using this in our version of the script, so instead we'll see that the last variable is a scan time of 500 milliseconds. So this is where we started actually messing with stuff a little bit. And you can see there's a couple things Spacemoon was working on that he commented out, and I'm not really, looks like he was trying to be able to differentiate who and the deauth was from and to. But here you can see I've added a couple variables, deauth, disassoc, and then these two variables are meant to kind of control the time. So these are the two that I've added to actually be able to count the deauth and disassociation packets rather than just the total number, which is C. And a little bit further on, we can see that I took a statement that used to be if the buffer element 12 equals disassociation or deauthentication, then increase the counter of C. Now, this all used to be one statement, but I've broken it into two expressions. So now it reads, if it's a disassociation frame, then set the cooldown timer for disassociation to 500 packets. If it is a deauthentication packet, set the cooldown timer again for 500 packets. And then if it's neither, subtract 1 from the cooldown timer unless the cooldown timer is already at 0, because we don't want to go into negative numbers. So let's go through what would happen if we detect a packet that matches one of these two filters. So if you followed our last Wireshark tutorial, it's a great way of understanding what's happening here, because we used a couple capture filters that allowed us to track deauthentication and disassociation attacks in exactly the same way, but took a lot more work because we were in Wireshark, we were reading through all these packets, and we had to set filters in order to show us the colors. This is actually doing the exact same thing we did in that tutorial, but instead we're doing it on a tiny microcontroller, and we're outputting to an LED to give us the color filter, more or less, that we set in Wireshark, only in a much more simple, cheap, affordable form that doesn't need a computer, aside from this little NodeMCU. So let's say that we get a packet that is a disassociation packet. Well, it'll hit this right here and it will match our filter. You might notice this is very similar to the Wireshark capture filter we set for disassociation packets. And because this sets our cooldown timer to 500, then when we scroll down a little further, here you can see in our setup, we set our pin mode to output, which means we'll be able to turn the LED on and off from these pins on D5, D6, D7, which I picked because there's a ground pin on the NodeMCU right next to it. And then finally, we'll go down to the loop, which is where the action actually happens. So again, let's say that we've detected a disassociation packet, and now our cooldown timer is at 500. Well, this right here asks if deauth is greater than or equal to 1, then turn the LED on. And it also allows for the option of it being inverted. Here we say if disassociation, if that variable, the value is greater than or equal to 1, then turn that LED on as well. However, if neither, then we're going to go ahead and turn them both off. So with that logic, each time we go through, it'll check to see if the packet that we're looking for matches this filter in the beginning. And if we continue to receive disassociation packets, it will continue to light up and reset the cooldown timer to 500 every single time that we detect it. Now, if we only detect, let's say 1, and then every packet after it is just a regular packet, this else clause right here will kick in and subtract 1 from our cooldown timer for deauthentication or disassociation each time we have a stream of 500 normal packets that follow the 1 that triggers the LED to go on. So what this means is we're detecting a packet that indicates an attack, we're turning on the LED for around 500 packets, and then if we get 500 normal packets that are not indicative of an attack, we assume the attack is over and turn off the LED. Now you can adjust this by kind of changing the deauth ratio. So here you can put a larger or a smaller value for each of these in order to keep the LED on for a longer or shorter amount of time. Now there's a couple other variables that will affect this, such as maybe the amount of Wi-Fi traffic in the area. So if you also have this scanning on a bunch of different networks, you may miss a lot of packets that are all being used to attack a network on one channel because your NodeMCU is scanning around on a bunch of other ones. So finally, I want to go back down here and look at the logic one more time to see how this really works. When we wire up the NodeMCU, we will make it so that a deauthentication triggers the pin D5 to go high and turns on the LED attached to it. If a disassociation packet is detected, we'll do the same for pin D7. Now, if both occur, then we'll see both of these colors turn on at the same time, indicating someone's using an attack that uses both disassociation and deauthentication. With all this put together and with the libraries included, then we can verify that our tools menu looks something like this. We should have the upload speed matching the CPU frequency and the port, which should be auto-detected when you plug it in. And when all of that's ready to go, you can go ahead and click on Verify. And as soon as it checks the sketch for any errors, you can click on the little arrow right here in order to push it to our NodeMCU. Now, once the sketch is finished pushing to the NodeMCU, we can go ahead and unplug it. And in this case, we'll just plug it into a power source in order to make sure that it can operate separately from our computer and we're not contaminating the results in any way. Once this powers up, I'm going to use AirGetIn and use the denial of service modules in order to launch an attack against a nearby wireless network and see if we can detect it. So I'm going to go ahead and open up a terminal window. Let's grab this one, and I'll also minimize some stuff so we don't have this clutter. There we go. So I'm going to clear this window, cd, and then cd airgetin. Now, if you haven't seen our guide on airgetin, it's a great tool, and it doesn't require much configuration. So we'll just do sudo bash /airgetin.sh. Now we'll run through the script really quickly, and we're just going to kind of dash right to the denial of service module. But first it'll check to see if we have all the stuff we need. In this case, we have all the minimum requirements, and then it'll also check and ask us, after checking to see if we have the newest version, which wireless network adapter we want to use. So today we're going to use the PAU 07S, which is a Panda Wireless Network adapter that has a fixed antenna but is Kali Linux compatible. So we're going to select option number 3. And now we're ready to go to option number 4, which is the DOS attacks menu. So we'll need to put our device into monitor mode, which is option number 2. And then once we set our device in monitor mode, we will select option 4 to scan for available targets. Now, I apologize because we're probably going to have to blur most of these out, but we were going to use a test network, and we noticed that simulated network just didn't work the way that a real one does. So unfortunately, once we let this run for a second, I will close this, and you can see our test network on here is the Midget and Dwarf Support Center, but we're not going to use this today. Instead, we're going to use something else. So I'll pick option 12, and once we've loaded all of these details, we can see the channel we're going to attack on, and then we have this handy list of different attacks we can execute. Now, if I was a script kiddie, these two options represent the main different forks of Wi-Fi attacks that are available, so these serve as a great testbed to show whether or not we can detect these sorts of attacks and what they look like on our new NodeMCU deauth detector. So let's launch a denial of service attack, and we'll start with one that's a little bit more difficult to detect and might take a little bit more time. So we're going to select option 5. We're going to press N for channel hopping because we're only going after something that's on one channel. And then when we press return, we should see, there we go, that we're getting both blue and red, which is purple. So what that means is that, oh, and we've also deauthed ourselves. So that's great. We can see it's very effective. So because we're getting blue, we know that we're getting a mix of both deauthentication and disassociation. That's what the purple means. But in particular, blue means disassociation, which happens when we're using MDK3. So now we're going to go ahead and select option 6 and use a different kind of attack and see if it looks different on our detector. So we're going to select option 6. We're going to again press N for no, and then we're ready to fire off this attack. So we'll press return, and we can see red. So now I can very visibly see the difference between a MDK3 based attack and an attack that's only using deauthentication packets. Now I'll stop this attack, and after I think we set the cooldown timer to 500 packets go by that are normal packets and not attack packets, we should see the LED turn off and go back to normal. There we are. So we can detect when an attack is in progress, and we can even classify the type of attack with this modification and spin on the NodeMCU. In fact, we can make sure that we're identifying this properly so that if we're getting a couple errant deauthentication packets, we know that maybe it's a misconfigured device in a network nearby and not an attacker. Or we could even interpret the intent of the person who's deauthenticating nearby networks. Now what I mean by this is if we get a couple sporadic deauth packets, that's usually a tool like maybe bside-ng, which is finding and then attacking networks in order to harvest WPA credentials. You might also just see a continuous stream of red like we just saw, which is a denial of service attack or jamming attack, and both of these are easy to detect with our NodeMCU. It's just a matter of being able to see what's happening, kind of determine what the pattern means, and then kind of also see what the attacker is up to by looking at what tool they're using and how they're using it to affect nearby wireless networks. Now, if you're in an area that has an unusual amount of wireless traffic, either a whole lot or not very much, you can always go back into our Arduino sketch, and I'll show you what you can do to modify this. If you go back to the part that is specifying the cooldown timer right here. So this value, you can set this either higher in order to leave it on for longer, maybe if you want to make an attack more visible, or you can set it for shorter if you just want to show a short little blip every time you receive that sort of packet. Now, it really depends on the way you're trying to visualize this data, so you can adjust this up or down depending on what exactly it is you want to do with this NodeMCU. So I encourage you to modify these variables yourself, because as you've noticed, this is a simple use of the buff and then the 12th item in this list. So if we're looking to match different types of packets, maybe other management type frames, then we can use this to kind of create our own sniffer or fork this code to do something more exciting if that's what we want to do. If you like this customized version of Spacesoon's deauth detector, there's a lot you can do to customize the code yourself. First, you can add a different sort of alert, like maybe an alarm that's audible instead of an LED, to make a deauth attack a little bit more noticeable if that's what you're looking to do. You can also modify the code to look for different types of packets because of the way it's laid out, which is a great way to get started learning about the NodeMCU and searching for different types of packets. Now, you can also use a resistor to prolong the life of your LED, which I highly recommend because I get a lot of comments telling me that in most cases you will want to throw one of those in. That's all we have for this episode of Cyber Weapons Lab. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you have any thoughts or feedback on the show, make sure to let me know on Twitter, because I'd love to hear from you. We'll see you next time.